Chapter 9. The Notebook. After half an hour of rest, Zhao Mingrui, who now viewed himself as Klein, finally recovered. In the meantime, he found that there were now 4 black dots on the back of his hand, which happened to form a small square. These 4 black spots faded and disappeared quickly, but Klein knew that they were still hiding in his body, waiting to be awakened. 4 spots forming a square. Is it in correspondence with the 4 pieces of staple food at the 4 corners of the room? Does this mean that in the future, I don't need to prepare the food and can do the ritual and chants immediately? Klein made a guess. This might seem good, but the emergence of the spots was ominous, and things that one lacked understanding of were always scary. The fact that those inexplicable Chinese divinations from Earth could produce effects here, the strange transmigration in his sleep, the mysterious murmurings that almost drove him crazy during the ritual, and the mysterious and trippy gray world, whose significance he had no idea of, made Klein shiver in the hot weather of June. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. He recalled this saying as he was experiencing the fear of the unknown acutely. There was in him an unprecedented and irresistible urge to make contact with the mysterious domain, to learn more, and to explore the unknown. There was also a contradicting escape mentality within him, compelling him to pretend nothing had happened. Intense sunlight shone through the window onto the desk. It was as if there were grains of gold sprinkled on the desk. Klein gazed at the desk, feeling as though he had come into contact with warmth and hope. He relaxed slightly, and a strong sense of fatigue washed over him. His eyelids were as heavy as lead as they kept closing themselves. It must have been the combined effect of the sleepless night and the tiring encounter. Klein shook his head and pushed himself up with the aid of the desk. He stumbled towards the double-decked bed, completely disregarding the rye bread placed at the 4 corners of the room. He fell asleep immediately after he lay down. Klein was woken up by hunger pangs. When he opened his eyes, he felt rejuvenated. There's still a slight headache. He rubbed his temples and sat up. He was so hungry that he could eat a horse. He returned to the desk while straightening his shirt. He picked up the silver vine leaf pocket watch. The pocket watch lid sprang open and the second hand was ticking. 12:30. I slept for 3 hours. Klein put the pocket watch back into his linen shirt pocket and while swallowing. In the northern continent, there were 24 hours in a day, 60 minutes in an hour, and 60 seconds in a minute. Whether each second passed at the same rate here compared to Earth was unknown to Klein. At this moment, he could not even think of terms such as mysticism, rituals, or the grayish world. His mind was occupied by one thing: food. He would leave the thinking to after his meals. Only then could he work. Klein picked up the loaves of rye bread from the 4 corners and wiped off the minute specks of dust on it without any hesitation. He planned on making one of them his lunch. He decided to dig into the offerings because he only had 5 pence with him, and there was a tradition of eating the offerings back in his hometown. After all, there was not any observable change to the bread. It was better to be frugal. Of course, the memory and habits left behind by the original Klein had also played a role. It was a huge waste to use the expensive gas only to light up the room. So Klein took out a furnace and boiled water with it after adding some coal. He paced around as he waited. Klein thought, as he looked around, hungry. He had nothing better to do. His eyes seemed to turn avaricious when he set his eyes on the pound of mutton in the cupboard. Klein thought as he shook his head and rejected the idea of cooking half of it right now. Although he often ate outside, he had still developed some basic culinary skills, owing to his living in a big city alone. His dishes were not delicious, but they were at least edible. Klein turned his body around so that the mutton would not seduce him. Then, he suddenly realized that he had also bought peas and potatoes in the morning. Klein immediately had an idea. He quickly turned back to the cupboard and took out 2 potatoes from a tiny pile of them. He first cleaned the potatoes in the public bathroom and then added them into a pot so they were boiled together with the water. After a while, he sprinkled into the water some yellow coarse salt from the spices container he found inside the cupboard. He waited patiently for a few minutes before lifting the pot and pouring the soup into a few cups in a bowl. He took out the potatoes with a fork and placed them on the desk at the end. He blew at the potato as he peeled it bit by bit. The fragrance of boiled potato diffused through the air. It smelled very appetizing. He salivated crazily. The heat could not deter him any longer. Klein took a bite despite having the potato only half peeled. It had a powdery texture and tasted sweet as he chewed. He was instantly filled with emotions and he wolfed down the 2 potatoes. He even ate some of the skin. Then, he held up the bowl and enjoyed the soup. The pinch of salt and water proved to be thirst-quenching. A filled Klein exclaimed in his head. Meanwhile, he tore off a small piece of bread and dipped it into the soup to eat it softened. Perhaps the ritual was too tiring. Klein ate 2 loaves of bread, which amounted to a whole pound. Klein felt he was finally rejuvenated. He enjoyed the joy of life after he drank the soup before tidying up. Then, he took in the lustrous sunshine happily. He sat back at the desk and began planning. I can't escape. I must think of a way to come into contact with mysticism and become a beyonder as mentioned by Justice and the Hanged Man. I need to overcome the fear of the unknown. The only way now is to wait for the next gathering. I need to try listen for the formula of the spectator potion or other things related to mysticism. There are 4 more days before Monday. Before that, I need to first figure out the problem with Klein. Why did he commit suicide? What happened to him? Unable to transmigrate back and wash his hands of everything, Klein picked up the notebook that lay on the table. He wanted to find hints that could help him regain his lost memory fragments. The original Klein obviously had the habit of taking notes. He also liked to write diaries. Klein was fully aware that the cabinet that supported the desk on the right stored a whole stack of completed notebooks. The book he had began on the 10th of May. Matters regarding his school and mentor, as well as content pertaining to knowledge, were at the beginning. 12th May. Mr. Azik mentioned that the common language used by the Balam Empire in the southern continent also developed from ancient Phizak, a branch of Jotun. Why is this so? Does this mean that every sentient living being once spoke the same language? No, there has to be a mistake. According to the revelation of Evernight and the Book of Storms, giants were not the only hegemons of the world in primordial times. There were also elves, mutants, and dragons. Anyways, these are just myths and fantasies. Now, Neon 20. 16th May. Senior Associate Professor Cohen and Mr. Azik discussed the inevitability of the Age of Steam. Mr. Azik opined that it was just a coincidence, because if it wasn't for Emperor Roselle, the northern continent would still be wielding swords like the southern continent. Mentor argued that Mr. Azik had placed too much emphasis on the contribution of an individual. He believes that without progress, even if there wasn't an Emperor Roselle, there would be an Emperor Robert. Therefore, the Age of Steam might come late, but eventually come nevertheless. I found little meaning in their discussion. I prefer discovering new things and unraveling the hidden past. Perhaps I am more suited to study archaeology than history. No. 29th May. Welch found me and told me that he had acquired a notebook from the 4th epoch. Oh my goddess, a notebook from the 4th epoch. He didn't want to ask the archaeology department students for help, so he came to Naya and me to help him decode the contents. How can I refuse? Of course, I can only do it after my graduation defense. I can afford diverting my attention at this stage. This caught Klein's attention. Compared to the notes about history and viewpoint disagreements, the appearance of a notebook from the 4th epoch might have led to Klein's suicide. The 4th epoch was the epoch before the present Iron Age. Its history was mysterious and incomplete. Due to the fact that very few tombs, ancient cities, and records had been found, archaeologists and historians could only refer to the ambiguous records provided by the 7 major churches that centered around their religious teachings to roughly form the original picture. They knew the existence of the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsuist Empire. Having set his sights on solving the mystery and restoring history, Klein didn't have much interest in the first 3 eras, whose roots were closer to legends. He was more interested in the 4th epoch, also known as the Age of the Gods. So Klein was concerned for his future career and thus focused on the interview. But it was all futile. Klein could not resist exclaiming. Universities were still very scarce, and the majority of students were either from noble or wealthy families. As long as he did not have an extreme mindset, a commoner who had been admitted into university would have been able to build precious social connections through group discussions and networking events despite the prejudice and exclusion from the entrenched social circles. The very generous Welsh McGovern was an example. He was the son of a banker from Constant City, Mid-Zeeshire, Lone Kingdom. He was used to asking Naya and Klein for help because they were always in the same group for work. Without thinking further, Klein continued reading the notebook. 18th June. I have graduated. Farewell, Coy University. 19th June. I have seen the notebook. By comparing sentence structures and root words, I discovered that it is a modified form of ancient Physac. More precisely, over the course of its 1,000-year history, the Physac language had changed constantly, a little at a time. 20th June. We have deciphered the contents of the first page. The author was a member of a family called Antigonus. 21st June. He mentioned the Dark Emperor. This is anachronistic with regards to the time this notebook is deduced to be written. Is Professor wrong? Is Dark Emperor a common title for every emperor of the Solomon Empire? 22nd June. The Antigonus family apparently had a very high standing in the Solomon Empire. The author mentions that he was making a secret transaction with a person named Tudor. Is it related to the Tudor dynasty? 23rd June. I am trying to restrain myself from thinking about the notebook and going to Welch's place. I need to prepare for the interview. It's very important. 24th June. Naya tells me that they have found something new. I think I need to check it out. 25th June. From the new deciphered content, the author had accepted a mission to visit the nation of the Evernight, situated at the summit of the highest peak of the Hornassus mountain range. Oh my goddess! How can a nation exist at the summit of that peak, which is over 6,000 meters above sea level? How do they survive? 26th June. Are these strange things real? The record ended at this point. Jo Mingrui transmigrated in the early hours of the 28th, which means to say that there was indeed an entry for June 27th. It's that line. Everyone will die, including me. Klein flipped to the page he first saw when he arrived, feeling goosebumps while he made the deduction. In order to solve the mystery of the original Klein's suicide, he thought that he should visit Welch and take a look at the ancient notebook. However, with a lot of experience from novels, movies, and TV drama series, he suspected that if they were really related, this visit would be very dangerous. Those who went investigating castles despite knowing that they were haunted served as a warning. However, he had to go since escaping would never solve the problem. It would only make things worse until it welled over and completely drowned him. There was a series of quick and forceful knocks. Klein sat straight up and listened. The knocks echoed through the empty hallway. Chapter 10. The Norm. Who is it? Klein was thinking about the mysterious suicide of the original owner of this body and the unknown danger he might encounter when he heard the sudden knock on the door. He subconsciously opened the drawer, took out the revolver, and asked vigilantly. The other party was quiet for 2 seconds before a slightly sharp voice, in Alwa's accent, replied, "It's me, Mountbatten, bitch Mountbatten." The voice paused for a moment before adding, "Police." When Klein heard this name, he immediately thought of the owner of this name. He was the policeman in charge of the street where the apartment was located. He was a rude, brutal, hands-on man. But perhaps only such a man could be a deterrent for alcoholics, thieves, part-time thieves, villains, and hooligans. And his unique voice was one of his trademarks. "Okay, I'll be right there," Klein responded loudly. He had planned to put the revolver back into the drawer, but thinking that he had no idea why the police was outside and that they might search the room or do other things, he cautiously ran to the stove, where the flames had already been extinguished, and put the revolver in it. Then he picked up the coal basket, shook a few pieces into the stove, covered the gun, and finally placed the kettle over the stove to conceal everything. After doing all of that, he tidied up his clothes and quickly approached the door and murmured, "Sorry, I just had a nap." Outside the door stood 4 policemen in black and white checkered uniforms with peaked caps. Bitch Mountbatten, the one with a brown beard, coughed and said to Klein, "These 3 inspectors have something to ask you." Klein looked at the shoulder badges of the other 3 reflexively and found that 2 of them had 3 silver hexagons and 1 had 2, both of which looked superior to bitch Mountbatten, who had only 3 chevrons. As a history student, Klein did little to no research into the ranks of police epaulets, except that bitch Mountbatten often boasted of being a senior sergeant. Influenced by conversations with Benson, Welch, and his classmates, Klein had the common sense to make way and point into the room. "Please come in. How might I help you?" The leader of the three inspectors was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. He seemed to be able to read the mind of a person and make them fearful. His eyes were wrinkled, and the edge of his hat revealed light brown hair. He looked around the room and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know Welch McGovern? What's wrong with him?" Klein quivered and blurted back, "I'm the one asking the questions." The dignified, middle-aged police inspector had a stern look in his eyes. The inspector next to him, also wearing 3 silver hexagons, looked at Klein and smiled gently. "Don't be nervous. It's just a routine questioning." This policeman was in his 30s, with a straight nose and gray eyes that, like a lake in an ancient forest that no one visited, gave him an indescribable sense of depth. Klein took a breath and organized his words. "If you mean Welch McGovern, the graduate of Coy University from Constant, then I'm sure I know him. We are classmates with the same mentor, Senior Associate Professor Quentin Cohen. In the Lone Kingdom, professor was not only a professional title, but also a position, just like the combination of professors and department deans on Earth. That meant there could only be one professor in a university's department. If an associate professor wanted to become professor, they had to wait for their superior to retire, or force out their superior with their abilities. As talents needed to be retained, the Kingdom's Higher Education Commission had added senior associate professors in the 3-level system of lecturers, associate professors, and professors after years of observation. This title was given to anyone with high academic achievements or with enough seniority but did not make it to the position of professor. At this point, Klein looked into the eyes of the middle-aged police inspector and thought for a second. "To be honest, our relationship is quite good. During this period, I met with him and Naya frequently to interpret and discuss the 4th epic notebook that belonged to him. Inspectors, did something happen to him?" Instead of answering, the middle-aged police inspector looked sideways at his gray-eyed colleague. The inspector with the peaked cap and ordinary looks replied mildly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Welch has passed away." "What?" Despite having some hunches, Klein could not help but shout out in astonishment. "What about Naya?" Klein questioned hurriedly. Naya passed away too," the gray-eyed police inspector said quite calmly. "Both of them died in Mr. Welch's house." "Killed?" Klein had a vague guess. The gray-eyed inspector shook his head. "No, the scene suggests that they committed suicide. Mr. Welch hit the wall with his head many times, covering the wall with blood. Ms. Naya drowned herself in a basin. Yes, the kind used to wash your face." "That's impossible." Klein's hairs stood on their ends as he seemed capable of imagining the strange scene. The gray-eyed inspector continued, "We believe so too, but the autopsy results and the situation at the scene exclude factors such as drugs and external forces. They, being Mr. Welch and Ms. Naya, showed no signs of struggling." Before Klein could speak again, he stepped into the room and asked, pretending to be casual, "When was the last time you saw Mr. Welch, or Ms. Naya?" As he spoke, he gestured with his eyes to his colleague with 2 silver hexagons. He was a young police inspector and looked about the same age as Klein. With black sideburns and green pupils, he was good-looking and had a poet's romantic temperament. When he heard the question, Klein thought about it and answered it thoughtfully. "It should be June 26th. We were reading a new chapter in the notes. Then, I went home to prepare for my interview on June 30th. The interview was for the history department of Tianjin University." Tianjin was known as the City of Universities. There were 2 universities, Tianjin and Coy, as well as technical schools, law colleges, and business colleges. It was second only to Backlund, the capital. As soon as he finished, he saw the young police inspector walk towards his desk in the corner of his eye and pick up the notes which resembled more of a diary. "Hey!" Klein cried out. The young inspector smiled back at him but did not stop flipping through his notes, while the gray-eyed inspector explained, "This is a necessary procedure." At this time, Bitch Mountbatten and the dignified middle-aged police inspectors were just watching without interrupting or assisting in the search. Klein had intended to question them, but on second thought, the judicial system of the Lone Kingdom did not seem to have such a thing as search warrants. At least he did not know if there was one. After all, the police force had only been established for 15 or 16 years. When the original owner of this body was still a child, they were still called public security officers. Klein couldn't stop it. He watched the young inspector flip through his notes, but the gray-eyed inspector did not ask any questions. What is this strange thing? The young police inspector turned to the end of the notes and suddenly asked, "And what does this mean? Everyone will die, including me." Klein was prepared to quibble, but it suddenly occurred to him that he had planned to connect with the police in case of possible danger, but he had no reasons or excuses. He made a decision in less than a second. Putting his hand over his forehead, he answered painfully, "I have no idea. I really have no idea. When I woke up this morning, I felt I wasn't quite right, as if I had forgotten something. It's especially true for whatever happened recently. I don't even know why I'd written such a sentence. Sometimes, being frank was the best way to solve a problem. Of course, it required skills. There were things that could be said and could not be said, and the order of what was said first mattered. As an expert keyboard warrior, Klein was also good at sophistry. That is ridiculous. Do you think we are fools?" Bitch Mountbatten could not help but interject angrily. "I'm speaking the truth," Klein responded frankly, looking into the eyes of Mountbatten and middle-aged police inspectors. "It really could not be more true." "Maybe it is," the gray-eyed police inspector said slowly. Klein was surprised himself. The gray-eyed inspector smiled at him and said, "An expert will come in 2 days, and believe me, she should be able to help you to recall your lost memories." Klein frowned. He suddenly felt like face-palming himself. The young police inspector put down his notes and searched his desk and room. Fortunately, he focused on books instead of lifting the kettle. "Well, Mr. Klein, thank you for your cooperation. We advise that you'd better not leave Tingen for the coming days. If you have to, please notify Inspector Mountbatten, or you'll become a fugitive," the gray-eyed police inspector warned. Klein was at a loss. Nevertheless, he wanted to solve the odd turn of events brought about by Welch too. So he nodded. That wouldn't be an issue. The inspectors exited the room one by one, and the young man at the end suddenly patted Klein on the shoulder. "It's really nice. Very lucky." What? What?" Klein's face was puzzled. The green-eyed police inspector with a poet's temperament smiled and said, "Generally speaking, the norm is for all the involved parties to die in such an event. We are very glad and fortunate to see you still alive." After that, he exited the room and closed the door behind him in well-mannered manner. On this June afternoon, Klein was chilling all over.